Got one viewer. Eric is here. Just waiting for Steven. Gonna sit here and wait for Steven. It's not showing any viewers anymore. I hope this doesn't end on a cliffhanger also, because I'll be really upset. Where's Steven? He was online. It's not showing me viewers. It wasn't a second ago, but okay, now it is again.
Mac OS contains a built-in screen reader called
Sorry.
VoiceOver. If you know how to use VoiceOver,
I don't know how to get that to stop. Sorry, I have this like propped up on my laptop. And my laptop crapped out on me, and I had to actually do I had to like wipe it. So I lost everything, which is okay because it was my work computer, and everything that was personal that I cared about was backed up. But I have to set my whole computer up again. This is a smartwatch. It's is that what you were asking? It's I just got a new phone. I'm talking to it right now. And it's a Samsung Galaxy, and this is the watch. They gave me this for free. I just have to pay like $10 a month to keep it activated, but the watch was free. I can't get the watch face to stay on. It's also like upside down, but yeah, I love this watch. It's great. So we're here, we're ready to finish this book. Windows 11, I don't know. It's Mojave. Wait, Windows. No, this is Mac. Anyway, Mac OS Mojave. I just installed it, and for some reason, my hard drive, the internal hard drive, was like unmounting itself repeatedly, and I couldn't get it to stop. So I had to just like delete and reinstall and do all this stuff. Thanks. There's like 2 earrings that are mismatched. There's a little key and a big key. Again, these are from the Ready Player One thingy they had when that movie came out. The thing on Hollywood and Highland. I don't know what you call it. It was like a maze kind of thing. And they had some merch there. Can't remember if I bought it or if it was free. I know they gave out some free stuff. But this came in a pack of like, there were several keys. And none of them... Actually, I don't think this is part of it. There were 3 keys. They were all the same size. That's right. They were different designs, but it's based on the movie and the book, so there were like 3 different kinds of keys. And then this... feel like... maybe this was part of it. I don't remember anymore. I have a lot of like mismatched earrings anyway, so I tend to either never wear earrings, or when I do, sometimes I will mismatch them because I don't have the other one and I don't want to waste them, and they're nice earrings. Of course you do, Steven. Okay, anyway, book time. So it's going to be like a little longer than usual. So, let me get hydrated. This is it. We're in the end game now. Chapter 147. Debts. Since I had a great deal of free time on my hands, midway through the term I hired the use of a 2-horse fetter cart and headed to Tarbien on a bit of a lark. It took me all of Reaving to get there, and I spent most of Sendling visiting old haunts and paying old debts. A cobbler who had been kind to a shoeless boy, an innkeeper who had let me sleep on his hearth some nights, a tailor I had terrorized. Parts of Waterside were strikingly familiar, while other pieces I didn't recognize at all. That didn't particularly surprise me. A city as busy as Tarbean is constantly changing. What did surprise me was the strange nostalgia I felt for this place that had been so cruel to me. I had been gone for 2 years. For all practical purposes, it was a lifetime ago. It had been a span of days since the last rain, and the city was dry as a bone. The shuffling feet of 100,000 people kicked up a cloud of fine dust that filled the city streets. It covered my clothes and got in my hair and eyes, making them itch. I tried not to dwell on the fact that it was mostly pulverized horse shit, with an assortment of dead fish, coal smoke, and urine thrown in for flavor. If I breathed through my nose, I was assaulted with the smell. But if I breathed through my mouth, I could taste it, and the dust filled my lungs, making me cough. I didn't remember it being as bad as this. Had it always been so dirty here? Had it always smelled this bad? After half an hour of searching, I finally found the burned-out building with a basement underneath. I had made my way down the stairs and through the long hallway to a damp room. Trappist was still there, barefoot and wearing the same tattered robe, tending to his hopeless children in the cool dark below the city streets. He recognized me. Not as other people would, not as a budding hero out of stories. Trappist had no time for such things. He remembered me as the smudgy, starveling boy who fell down his stairs fever-sick and crying one winter night. You could say I loved him even more for that. I gave him as much money as he would take, 5 talents. I tried to give him more, but he refused. If he spent too much money, he said, it would attract the wrong sort of attention. He and his children were safest if nobody noticed them. I bowed to his wisdom and spent the remainder of the day helping him. I pumped water and fetched bread. I made a quick examination of the children, then took a trip to an apothecary and brought back a few things that would help. Lastly, I tended to Trappist himself, at least as much as he would allow. I rubbed his poor, swollen feet with camphor and mother leaf, then made him a gift of tight-fitting stockings and a good pair of shoes so he wouldn't have to go barefoot in the damp of the basement anymore. As the afternoon faded into evening, ragged children began to arrive in the basement. They came looking for a bit of food, or because they were hurt or hoping for a safe place to sleep. They all eyed me suspiciously. My clothes were new and clean. I didn't belong there. I wasn't welcome. If I stayed, there would be trouble. At the very least, my presence would make some of the starveling children so uncomfortable they wouldn't stay the night, so I said goodbye to Trappist and left. Sometimes leaving is the only thing you can do. Since I had a few hours before the tavern started to fill up, I bought a single piece of creamy writing paper and a matching envelope of heavy parchment. They were extremely fine quality, much nicer than anything I'd ever owned before. Next, I found a quiet cafe and ordered drinking chocolate with a glass of water. I arranged the paper on the table and brought out pen and ink from my shade. Then I wrote in an elegant, fluid script, Ambrose, the child is yours. You know it is true, and so do I. I fear my family will disown me. If you do not behave as a gentleman and see to your obligations, I will go to your father and tell him everything. Do not test me in this. I am resolved. I didn't sign a name, merely wrote a single initial, which could have been an ornate R or perhaps a shaky B. Then, dipping my finger into my glass of water, I let several drops fall onto the page. They swelled the paper a bit and smeared the ink slightly before I blotted them away. They made a fair approximation of teardrops. I let one final heavy drop fall onto the initial I'd signed, obscuring it even more. Now the letter looked as if it could also be an F or a P or an E, perhaps even a K. It could be anything, really. I folded the paper carefully, then walked over to one of the room's lamps and melted a generous blob of sealing wax onto the fold. On the outside of the envelope I wrote, Ambrose Jackus, University, in parentheses 2 miles west of Imre. Benlay Baron, Central Commonwealth. I paid for my drink and headed to Drover's lot. When I was just a few streets away, I removed my shade and tucked it into my travel sack. Then I dropped the letter in the street and stepped on it, scuffing it around with my foot a bit before picking it up and brushing it off. I was almost to the square when I saw the final thing I needed. "Hoy there!" I said to an old whiskery man sitting against a building. "I'll give you a halfpenny if you let me borrow your hat." The old man pulled the draggled thing off and looked at it. His head was very bald and very pale underneath. He squinted a bit in the late afternoon sunlight. "My hat?" he asked, his voice rough. "You can have it for a whole penny, and my blessing, too." He gave a hopeful grin as he held out a thin, shaky hand. I gave him a penny. "Could you hold this for a second?" I passed him the envelope, then used both hands to screw the old, shapeless hat down over my ears. I used a nearby shop window to make sure every scrap of my red hair was tucked away underneath. "Suits you," the old man said, giving a phlegmy cough. I reclaimed the letter, and eyed the smudgy fingerprints he'd left. From there it was a quick step to Drover's lot. I slouched a bit and narrowed my eyes as I wandered through the milling throng. After a couple minutes, my ear caught the distinctive sound of a southern vintage accent, and I walked over to a handful of men loading a wagon with burlap sacks. "Hoy," I said, putting on the same accent. Oh, okay, I didn't know he was doing an accent. Pretend I'm doing an accent. "You folk heading up Imra way?" One of the men heaved his sack into the wagon and walked over, dusting off his hands. "Heading through there," he said. "You looking for a ride?" I shook my head and brought the letter out of my travel sack. "I've got a letter for up that way. I was hoping to take it myself, but my ship sails tomorrow. I bought it from a sailor off in Gannery for a full quarter bit," I said. "He had it himself off some noble gel for a single bit." I winked. She was quite urgent that it get to him, I hear. "You paid quarter bit?" the man said, already shaking his head. "You grummer. Ain't nobody going to pay that much for a letter." "Heh," I said, holding up a finger. "You ain't seen who's it for yet." I held it up for him to see. He squinted. "Jacques?" he said, slowly, then his face lit with recognition. "Is that Baron Jacques' boy, then?" I nodded smugly. "The eldest himself. Boy rich as that should pay a fair piece for a letter from his lady. Much as whole noble, I figure." He eyed the letter. "Could be," he said cautiously. "But look, it ain't got anything on it other than university. I've been up that way. That ain't a small place." "Baron Jacques' boy ain't gonna sleep in the tin shack," I said crossly. "Ask someone what the fanciest place is. That's where he'll be." The man nodded to himself, his hand creeping unconsciously toward his purse. "I suppose I could take it off your hands," he said grudgingly, "but only at a quarter bit. I'm taking a risk anyways at that." "Have a heart, now," I protested pitifully. "I brought it 800 miles. That's worth better than nothing." "Fine," he said, pulling coins out of his purse. "I'll give you 3 bits, then." "I'd take half a round," I grumbled. "You'll take 3 bits," he said, holding out a grubby hand. I handed him the letter. "Remember to tell him it's from a noble lady," I said as I turned to leave. "Rich tosh. Get whatever you can off him, that's what I say." I left the square, then straightened my shoulders and took off the hat. I pulled my shade back out of my travel sack and swirled it easily around my shoulders. I started to whistle, and as I passed the bald old beggar, I returned his hat and gave him the 3 bits besides. When I first heard the stories people were telling about me at the university, I'd expected them to be short-lived. I thought they would flare up, then die just as quickly, like a fire exhausting its fuel. But that hadn't been the case. The tales of Kvath rescuing girls and bedding Florian mixed and mingled with scraps of truth and the ridiculous lies I'd spread to bolster my reputation. There was fuel aplenty, so the stories swirled and spread like a brush fire with the wind blowing hard behind it. Honestly, I didn't know if I should be amused or alarmed. When I went to Imre, people would point at me and whisper to each other. My notoriety spread until it was impossible for me to casually cross the river and eavesdrop on the stories people told. Tarbean, on the other hand, was 40 miles away. After I left Drover's lot behind, I returned to the room I'd rented in one of the nicer parts of Tarbean. In this part of the city, the wind off the ocean brushed away the stink and the dust, leaving the air feeling sharp and clear. I called up water for a bath, and in a fit of lavish spending that would have left my younger self dizzy, I paid 3 pennies to have the porter take my clothes to the nearest sealedish laundry. Then, clean and sweet-smelling again, I went down to the tap room. I'd picked the inn carefully. It wasn't fancy, but it wasn't seedy either. The tap room was low-ceilinged and intimate. It sat at the corner of 2 of Tarbean's most well-traveled roads, and I could see sealedish traders rubbing elbows with Yiddish sailors and vintage wagoneers. It was the perfect place for stories. It wasn't long before I was lurking at the end of the bar, listening to how I'd killed the black beast of Trebon. I was stunned. I had actually killed a rampaging Dracus in Trebon, but when Nina had come to visit me a year ago, she hadn't known my name. My growing reputation had somehow swept through the town of Trebon and gathered up that story in its wake. There at the bar, I learned many things. Apparently I owned a ring of amber which could force demons to obey me. I could drink all night and never be the worse for it. Locks opened at the barest touch of my hand, and I had a cloak made all out of cobwebs and shadows. That was also the first time I heard anyone call me Kvath the Arcane. It was not a new name, apparently. The cluster of men listening to the story simply nodded along when they heard it. I learned that Kvath the Arcane knew a word that would stop arrows dead in the air. Kvath the Arcane only bled if the knife that cut him was made of raw, untempered iron. The young clerk was building to the dramatic finish of the story, and I was genuinely curious as to how I was going to stop the demon beast with my ring shattered and my cloak of shadows nearly burned away. But just as I forced my way into Trebon's church, shattering the door with a magic word and a single blow of my bare hand, the door of the inn burst open, startling everyone as it banged hard against the wall. A young couple stood there. The woman was young and beautiful, dark-haired and dark-eyed. The man was richly dressed and pale with panic. "I don't know what's the matter," he cried, looking about wildly. "We were just walking, and then she couldn't breathe." I was at her side before anyone else in the room had time to stand. She had half collapsed onto an empty bench, with her escort hovering over her. She had one hand pressed against her chest, while the other pushed him away weakly. The man ignored it and crowded close to her, speaking in a low, urgent voice. The woman kept sliding away from him until she was at the edge of the bench. I pushed him urgently aside. "I think she wants her space from you right now." "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice shrill. "Are you a physician? Who is this man? Someone fetch a physician at once." He tried to elbow me aside. "You!" I pointed to a large sailor sitting at a table. "Take this man and put him over there." My voice snapped like a whip, and the sailor jumped to his feet, grabbed the young gentleman by the back of his neck, and scuffed him tidily away. I turned back to the woman and watched as her perfect mouth opened. She strained and drew in only the barest rasp of a breath. Her eyes were wild and wet with fear. I moved close to her and spoke in my gentlest tones. "You will be fine. All is well," I reassured her. "You need to look in my eyes." Her eyes fixed on mine, then widened in recognition, in amazement. "I need you to breathe for me." I laid one hand against her straining chest. Her skin was flushed and hot. Her heart was thrilling like a frightened bird. I laid my other hand along her face. I looked deeply into her eyes. They were like dark pools. I leaned close enough to kiss her. She smelled of steeless flower, of green grass, of road dust. I felt her strain to breathe. I listened. I closed my eyes. I heard the whisper of a name. I spoke it soft, but close enough to brush against her lips. I spoke it quiet, but near enough so that the sound of it went twining through her hair. I spoke it hard and firm and dark and sweet. There was a rush of indrawn air. I opened my eyes. The room was still enough that I could hear the velvet rush of her second desperate breath. I relaxed. She laid her hand over mine, over her heart. "I need you to breathe for me," she repeated. "That's 7 words." "It is," I said. "My hero," Denna said, and drew a slow and smiling breath. Catching up on some comments. "It were powerful strange," I heard the sailor say on the other side of the room. There was somewhat in his voice. I swear by all the salt in me I felt like a puppet with my string pulled. I listened with half an ear. I guessed the deckhand simply knew to jump when a voice with the proper ring of authority told him to. But there was no sense in telling him that. My performance with Denna, combined with my bright hair and dark cloak, had identified me as cloth. So it would be magic no matter what I had to say about it. I didn't mind. What I had done tonight was worthy of a story or two. Because they recognized me, folk were watching us, but not coming very close. "Oh, finally, the cat's here." Who did you think it would be, Eric? Who did you think it would be? Louie, you're so late. You're just not getting here? Denna's gentleman friend had left before we thought to look for him, so the two of us enjoyed a certain privacy in our small corner of the tap room. "I should have known I'd come across you here," she said. "You're always where I least expect to find you. Have you migrated away from the university at last?" I shook my head. "I'm playing truant for a couple days." "Are you heading back soon?" "Tomorrow, actually. I've got a fetter cart." She smiled. "Would you like some company?" I gave her a frank look. "You must know the answer to that." Denna blushed a little and looked away. "I suppose I do." "Aw, baby." He's rubbing against my hand with his face. Your cute face. When she looked down, her hair cascaded off her shoulders, falling around her face. It smelled warm and rich, like sunshine and cider. "Your hair," I said. "Lovely." Surprisingly, she blushed even deeper at this and shook her head without looking up at me. "That's what we've come to after all this time?" she said, darting a look up at me. "Flattery?" It was my turn to be embarrassed, and I stammered. I would... I took a breath before reaching out to lightly touch a narrow, intricate braid, half hidden in her hair. "Your braid," I clarified. "It almost says, lovely." Her mouth made a perfect O of surprise, and one hand went self-consciously to her hair. "You can read it?" she said, her voice incredulous, her expression slightly horrified. Merciful Toulouse, isn't there anything you don't know? I've been learning Yiddish, I said, or trying to. It's got 6 strands instead of 4, but it's almost like a story knot, isn't it? Almost, she said. It's a damn sight more than almost. Her fingers plucked at the piece of blue string at the end of her braid. Even Yiddish folk barely know Yiddish these days, she said under her breath, plainly irritated. I'm not any good, I said. I just know some words. Even the ones that do speak it don't bother with the knots. She glared sideways at me. And you're supposed to read them with your fingers? You're supposed to read them with your fingers, not by looking at them. I've mostly had to learn by looking at pictures in books, I said. Denna finally untied the blue string and began to unfurl the braid, her quick fingers smoothing it back into her hair. You didn't have to do that, I said. I liked it better before. That's rather the point, isn't it? She looked up at me, tilting her chin proudly as she shook out her hair. There, what do you think now? I think I'm afraid to give you any more compliments, I said, not exactly sure what I'd done wrong. Her demeanor softened a bit, her irritation fading. It's just embarrassing. I never expected anyone to be able to read it. How would you feel if someone saw you wearing a sign that said, I am dashing and handsome? There was a pause. Before it could grow uncomfortable, I said, Am I keeping you from anything pressing? Only Squire Strahota. She made a negligent gesture toward her departed escort. Pressing, was he? I gave a half smile, raising an eyebrow. All men press, one way or another, she said with mock severity. They're still keeping to their book, then? Denna's expression grew rueful, and she sighed. I used to hope they'd disregard the book with age. Instead, I've found they've merely turned a page. She held up her hand, displaying a pair of rings. Now instead of roses, they give gold, and in the giving they grow sudden bold. At least you're being bored by men of means, I said consolingly. Who wants a mean man? She pointed out. Little matter if his wealth is above or below the board. I laid a gentling hand on her arm. You must forgive these men of mercenary thought, these poor rich men who, seeing that you can't be caught, attempt to buy a thing they know cannot be bought. Denna applauded delightedly. A plea of grace for enemies. I merely point out that you yourself are not above the giving of gifts, I said, as I myself well know. Her eyes hardened, and she shook her head. There is a great difference between a gift given freely and one that's meant to tie you to a man. There's truth to that, I admitted. Gold can make a chain as easily as iron. Still, one can hardly blame a man who hopes to decorate you. Hardly, she said with a smile that was both wry and weary. Many of their suggestions are rather indecorous. She looked at me. What of you? Would you have me decorated or indecorous? I have given some thought to that, I said with a secret smile, knowing I had her ring tucked safely away in my room at Anchor's. I made a show of looking her over. Both have their merits, but gold is not for you. You are too bright for burnishing. Denna gripped my arm and squeezed it, giving me a fond smile. Oh, my cloth, I've missed you. Half the reason I came back to this corner of the world was in the hope of finding you. She stood and held out her arm to me. Come, take me away from all this. Chapter 148. The Stories of Stones. On the long ride back to Imre, Denna and I spoke of 100 small things. She told me about the cities she had seen. Tinyu, Vartharet, Andeniven. I think she's back to just Denna. I think she's circled all the way back to Denna. I told her about Ademra and showed her a few pieces of hand language. She teased me about my growing fame, and I told her the truth behind the stories. I told her how things had fallen out with the mayor, and she was properly outraged on my behalf. But there was much we didn't discuss. Neither of us mentioned how we'd parted ways in Tavern. I didn't know if she had left in anger after our argument, or if she thought I had abandoned her. Any question seemed dangerous. Such a discussion would be uncomfortable at best. At worst, it might reignite our previous argument, and that was something I was desperate to avoid. Denna carried her harp with her, as well as a large traveling trunk. I guessed her song was finished, and she must be performing it. It bothered me that she would play it in Imre, where countless singers and minstrels would hear and carry it out across the world. Despite this, I said nothing. I knew that would be a hard conversation, and I needed to pick the time for it carefully. Neither did I mention her patron, though what the Cathay had told me preyed on my mind. I thought on it endlessly, had dreams about it. Florian was another matter we didn't discuss. For all the jokes Denna made about my rescuing bandits and killing virgins, she never mentioned Florian. She must have heard the song I'd written, as it was much more popular than the other stories she seemed to know so well. But she never mentioned it, and I was not enough of a fool to bring it up myself. So as we rode there were many things unspoken. The tension built in the air between us as the road jounced away beneath the cart's wheels. There were gaps and breaks in our conversation, silences that stretched too long, silences that were short but terrifyingly deep. We were trapped in the middle of one of those silences when we finally arrived at Imra. I dropped her off at the Boar's Head, where she planned to take rooms. I helped her carry her trunk upstairs, but the silence was even deeper there, so I skirted hastily around it, bade her a fond farewell, and fled without so much as kissing her hand. That night I thought of 10,000 things I could have said to her. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep until the deep, late hours of night. I woke early, feeling anxious and uneasy. I had breakfast with Simon and Fela, then went to Adept Sympathy, where Fenton beat me handily 3 duels in a row, setting him in the top rank for the first time since I'd returned to the university. With no other classes, I bathed and spent long minutes looking through my clothes before deciding on a simple shirt and the green vest Fela had set off my eyes. I worked my shade into a short cape, then decided not to wear it. I didn't want Denna thinking of Felurian when I came to call. Lastly, I slipped Denna's ring into my vest pocket and set off across the river to Imra. Once at the Boar's Head, I hardly had a chance to touch the door handle before Denna opened it and stepped out onto the street, handing me a basket lunch. I was more than slightly surprised. "How did you know?" She wore a pale blue dress that flattered her and smiled winsomely as she linked arms with me. Woman's intuition. "Ah," I said, trying to sound wise. The nearness of her was almost painful. The warmth of her hand on my arm, the smell of her like green leaves in the air before a summer storm. Do you know where we are bound as well? Only that you will take me there." When she spoke, she turned to face me, and I felt her breath against the side of my neck. "I gladly leave my trust in you." I turned to face her, thinking to say one of the clever things I'd thought of last night, but when I met her eyes, all words left me. I was lost in wonder, for how long I cannot even guess. For a long moment I was wholly hers. Denna laughed, jogging me from a reverie that might have stretched a moment or a minute. We made our way out of town, talking as easily as if there had never been a thing between us but sunlight and spring air. I led her to a place I'd found earlier that spring, a small dell sheltered by the backs of trees. A stream meandered past a grey stone that lay lengthwise on the ground, and the sun shone on a field of bright daisies, stretching their faces to the sky. Denna caught her breath when we crested the ridge and saw the carpet of daisies open out in front of her. "I have waited a long time to show these flowers how pretty you are," I said. That won me an enthusiastic embrace and a kiss burning on my cheek. Both were over before I knew they'd begun. Bemused and grinning, I led the way through the daisies to the grey stone near the stream. I removed my shoes and socks. Denna kicked off her shoes and tied up her skirts. Then she ran to the center of the stream until the water rose past her knees. "Do you know the secret of stones?" she asked as she reached into the water. The hem of her dress dipped into the stream, but she seemed unconcerned. "What secret is that?" She drew up a smooth, dark stone from the stream bed and held it out to me. "Come see." I finished cuffing up my pants and made my way into the water. She held up the dripping stone. "If you hold it in your hand and listen to it." She did so, closing her eyes. She stood still for a long moment, her face turned upward like a flower. I was drawn to kiss her, but I resisted. Finally she opened her dark eyes. They smiled at me. "If you listen close enough, it will tell you a story." "What story did it tell you?" I asked. "Once there was a boy who came to the water," Denna said. "This is the story of a girl who came to the water with the boy." They talked, and the boy threw the stones as if casting them away from himself. The girl didn't have any stones, so the boy gave her some. Then she gave herself to the boy, and he cast her away as he would a stone, unmindful of any falling she might feel. It was quiet for a moment, not sure if she was done. I was quiet for a moment, not sure if she was done. "It's a sad stone, then?" She kissed the stone and dropped it, watching as it settled to the sand. "No, not sad, but it was thrown once. It knows the feel of motion. It has trouble staying the way most stones do. It takes the offer that the water makes and moves sometimes." She looked up at me and gave a guileless smile. "When it moves, it thinks about the boy." I didn't know what to make of this story, so I tried to change the subject. "How did you learn to listen to stones?" "You'd be amazed at the things you hear if only you take time to listen." She gestured to the stream bed strewn with stones. "Try it. You never know what you might hear." Not sure what game she was playing at, I looked around for a stone, then cuffed up my shirt sleeve and reached into the water. "Listen," she prompted earnestly. Thanks to my studies with Illidan, I had a high tolerance for the ridiculous. I held the stone to my ear and closed my eyes. I wondered if I should pretend to hear a story. Then I was in the water, wet to the skin and spitting it. I spluttered and struggled to my feet while Denna laughed so hard she doubled over at the waist, barely able to stand. I moved toward her, but she skipped away with a little shriek that left her laughing even harder. So I held off chasing and made a show of wiping water from my face and arms. "Give up so easily?" she taunted. "Are you so sudden doused?" I lowered my hand into the water. "I was hoping to find my stone again," I said, pretending to look around for it. Denna laughed, shaking her head. "You'll not lure me in that easily." "I'm serious," I said. "I wanted to hear the end of its story." "What story was that?" she asked teasingly, not coming any closer. "It was the story of a girl who trifled with a powerful arcanist," I said. "She mocked him and she scoffed at him. She laughed at him full scornfully. He caught her one day in a brook, and rhyming he did quell her fears. And then the girl forgot to look behind her, and it led to tears." I grinned at her and pulled my hand out of the water. She turned in time for the wave to hit her. It was only as high as her waist, but it was enough to unbalance her. She went under in a swirl of dress and hair and bubbles. The current carried her to me, and I helped her to her feet, laughing. She came to the surface looking 3 days drowned. "Not fair!" she sputtered indignantly. "Not fair!" "I disagree," I said. "You're the fairest water maid I hope to see today." She splashed at me. "Flatter all you like. The truth remains for God to see. You cheated. I used honest trickery." She tried to dunk me then, but I was ready for it. We struggled for a while until we were pleasantly breathless. Only then did I realize how close she was. How lovely, how little our wet clothing seemed to separate us. Denna seemed to realize it at the same time, and we moved a little apart from each other, as if suddenly shy. The wind stirred, reminding us how wet we were. Denna skipped lightly to the shore and stripped away her dress without a moment's hesitation, tossing it over the gray stone to dry. She wore a white shift underneath that clung to her as she made her way back into the water. She gave me a playful push as she passed me by, then crawled atop a smooth black boulder that lay half submerged near the center of the stream. It was a perfect sunning stone, smooth basalt, dark as her eyes. The whiteness of her skin and the too revealing shift were a sharp contrast against it, almost too bright to look on. She lay on her back and spread her hair to dry. Its wetness made a pattern against the stone that spelled the name of the wind. She closed her eyes and tipped her face toward the sun. Felurian herself could not have been more lovely, more perfectly at ease. I moved toward the shore as well and stripped off my sodden shirt and vest. I had to be content with my wet pants, as I had nothing else to wear. "What does that stone tell you?" I asked to fill the silence as I laid my shirt next to her dress on the gray stone. She ran one hand over the smooth surface of the stone and spoke without opening her eyes. "This one is telling me what it is like to live in the water, but not be a fish." She stretched like a cat. "Bring the basket over here, would you?" I fetched the basket and waded out toward her, moving slowly so as not to splash. She lay perfect and still, as if asleep. But as I watched, her mouth curved into a smile. He doesn't use a lot of commas, so sometimes I read things weird. "You're quiet," she said, "but I can smell you standing there. Nothing bad, I hope." She shook her head gently, still not opening her eyes. "You smell like dried flowers, like strange spice smoldering, close to catching flame. Like river water, too, if I have any guess." She stretched again and smiled an easy smile, showing the perfect whiteness of her teeth, the perfect pinkness of her lips. She shifted her position on the rock slightly, almost as if she were making room for me. Almost. I thought of joining her. The stone was large enough for two if they were willing to lie close. "Yes," Denna said. "Yes to what?" I asked. "Your question," she said, tilting her face toward me, her eyes still closed. "You're about to ask me a question." She adjusted her position slightly on the stone. "The answer is yes." How was I to take that? What should I ask for? A kiss? More? How much was too much to ask? Was this a test? I knew asking too much would only drive her away. "I was wondering if you would move over a little," I said gently. "Yes." She shifted again, making more space beside her. Then she opened her eyes, and they went wide at the sight of me standing shirtless above her. She glanced down and relaxed when she saw my pants. I laughed, but her wide-eyed look of shock pushed me back into caution. I set the basket in the place I had thought to take myself. "What thought was that, my lady?" She colored a bit, embarrassed. "I didn't think you were the sort to bring a girl her lunch while you were running stark." She gave a little shrug, looked at the basket, at me. But I like you this way. My own bare-chested slave. She closed her eyes again. Feed me strawberries. I was happy to oblige, and so we passed the afternoon. These two, when are they just gonna, hook up already? Lunch was long gone, and the sun had dried us. For the first time since our fight in Tavern, I felt things were right between us. The silences no longer lay around us like holes in the road. I knew it had just been a matter of waiting patiently until the tension passed. As the afternoon slowly slid by, I knew this was the right time to bring up the subject I had been biting my tongue over for so long. I could see the dull green of old bruises on her upper arms, the remnant of a raised welt on her back. There was a scar on her leg above her knee, new enough that the red of it showed through the white of her shift. That's the perfect song right now, yes. All I needed to do was ask about them. If I phrased things carefully, she'd admit they were from her patron. From there, it would be a simple thing to draw her out, to convince her she deserved better, that whatever he was offering her was not worth this abuse. And for the first time in my life, I was in a position to offer her a way out. Hey, what are you doing? With Alvaron's line of credit and my work in the fishery, money would never be a problem for me. For the first time in my life, I was wealthy. I could give her a way to escape. What happened to your back? Denna asked softly, interrupting my train of thought. She was still reclining on her stone. I was leaning against it, my feet in the water. What? I asked, unconsciously turning a foolish half-circle. You're scarred all along your back, she said gently. I felt one of her cool hands touch my sun-warmed skin, tracing a line. I could hardly tell they were scars at first. They're pretty. She traced another line down my back. It looks like some giant child mistook you for a piece of paper and practiced his letters on you with a silver pen. She took her hand away, and I turned to face her. How did you get them? She asked. I caused some trouble at the university, I said somewhat sheepishly. They whipped you? She said, incredulous. Twice, I said. And you stay there? She asked as if she still couldn't believe it. After they did this to you? I shrugged it away. There are worse things than whipping, I said. There's nowhere else I can learn the things they teach here. When I want a thing, it makes it more than a little... What? When I want a thing, it takes more than a little blood to... It was only then I realized what I was saying. The masters whipped me. Her patron beat her, and we both stayed. How could I convince her my situation was different? How could I convince her to leave? Denna looked at me curiously, her head tilted to the side. What happens when you want a thing? I shrugged. I was just saying I'm not easily chased away. I've heard that about you, Denna said, giving me a knowing look. A lot of girls in Imra say you're not easily chased. That's C-H-A-S-T-E, if that wasn't clear. I was trying to... That's a visual pun right there, not an audible one. She sat upright and began to slide toward the edge of the stone. Her white shift twisted and slid slowly up her legs as she moved. I was about to comment on her scar, hoping I might still bring the conversation around to her patron, when I noticed Denna had stopped moving and was watching me as I stared at her bare legs. What do they say exactly? I asked, more for something to say than from any curiosity. She shrugged. Some think you're trying to decimate Imra's female population. She edged closer to the lip of the stone. Her shifted distractingly. Decimate would imply 1 in 10, I said, trying to turn it into a joke. That's slightly ambitious, even for me. How reassuring, she said. Do you bring all of them? She made a little gasp as she slipped down the side of the stone. She caught herself just as I was reaching out to help her. Bring them what? I asked. Roses, fool, she said sharply. Or have you turned that page already? Would you like me to carry you? I asked. Yes, she said. But before I could reach for her, she slid the rest of the way into the water, her shift gathering to a scandalous height before she slipped free into the stream. The water rose to her knee, just dampening the hem. Yeah, I don't know what a shift is either. I'm assuming it's some kind of undergarment that's maybe like a slip or something. My cat's attacking his own tail. Not Louis, the other cat. Louis lying down with his little back leg sticking back. Oh, he's so cute. But. We made our way back to the gravestone and silently worked our way into our now dry clothes. Denna fretted at the wetness at the hem of her shift. What are you doing? You're making a lot of noise over there. You know, I could have carried you, I said softly. Denna pressed the back of her hand up to her forehead. Another 7 words, I swoon. She fanned herself with her other hand. What should a woman do? Love me? I had intended to say it in my best flippant tone, teasing, making a joke of it, but I made the mistake of looking into her eyes as I spoke. They distracted me, and when the words left my mouth, they ended up sounding nothing at all the way I had intended. For a fleet second, she held my eyes with intent tenderness. Then a rueful smile quirked up the corner of her mouth. Oh, no, she said. Not that trap for me. I'll not be one of the many. I clenched my teeth, stuck somewhere between confusion, embarrassment, and fear. I'd been too bold and made a mess of things, just as I'd always feared. When had the conversation managed to run away from me? I beg your pardon, I said stupidly. You should. Denna straightened her clothes, moving with an uncharacteristic stiffness, and ran her hands through her hair, twisting it into a thick plait. Her fingers knitted the strands together, and for a second I could read it, clear as day. Don't speak to me. I might be thick, but even I can read a sign that obvious. I closed my mouth, biting off the next thing I'd been about to say. Then Denna saw me eyeing her hair and pulled her hands away self-consciously without tying off the braid. Her hair quickly spun free to fall loose around her shoulders. She brought her hands in front of her and twisted one of her rings nervously. Hold a moment, I said. I'd almost forgotten. I reached into the inner pocket of my vest. I have a present for you. Her mouth made a thin line as she looked at my outstretched hands. You too? She asked. I honestly thought you were different. I hope I am, I said, and I opened my hand. I'd polished it, and the sun caught the edges of the pale blue stone. Oh! Denna's hands went to her mouth, her eyes suddenly brimming. Is it really? She reached out with both hands to take it. It is, I said. She turned it over in her hands, then removed one of her other rings and slid it onto her finger. It is, she said in amazement, a few tears spilling over. How did you ever... I got it from Ambrose, I said. Oh, she said. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, and I felt the silence loom up between us again. It wasn't much trouble, I said. I'm just sorry it took so long. I can't thank you enough for this. Denna reached out and took my hand between hers. You would think that would have helped, that a gift and clasped hands would make things right between us, but the silence was back now, stronger than before, thick enough that you could spread it on your bread and eat it. There are some silences that even words cannot drive away. And while Denna was touching my hand, she wasn't holding it. There was a world of difference. Denna looked up at the sky. The weather's turning, she said. We should probably head back before it rains. I nodded and we left. Clouds cast their shadows across the field behind us as we went. Chapter 149, Tangled. Anchor's was deserted except for Sim and Fela sitting at one of the back tables. Hello. I made my way toward them and sat with my back to the wall. So, Sim asked as I slumped into my seat, how did yesterday go? I'd prefer I can't believe it's not silence. Oh, wow. How did yesterday go? I ignored the question, not really wanting to discuss it. What was yesterday? Fela asked curiously. He spent the day with Denna, Sim supplied. The whole day. I shrugged. Sim lost some of his buoyant manner. Not so well? He said carefully. Not particularly, I said. I looked behind the bar, caught Laurel's eye, and gestured for her to bring me some of whatever was in the pot. Care for a lady's perspective? Fela asked gently. I'd settle for yours. Simon burst out laughing, and Fela made a face. I'll help you in spite of that, she said. Tell Auntie Fela all about it. So I told her the bones of it. I tried my best to paint a picture of the situation, but the heart of it seemed to defy explication. It sounded foolish when I tried to put it into words. That's all, I said after several minutes of fumbling around the subject. Or at least that's enough of my talking about it. She confuses me like no other thing in the world. I picked at a splinter in the tabletop with my finger. I hate not understanding a thing. Laurel brought me warm bread and a bowl of potato soup. Anything else? She asked. I'm fine, thanks. I smiled at her, then observed her rear aspect as she made her way back to the bar. All right, then, Phyllis said in a business-like manner. Let's start with your good points. You're charming, handsome, and perfectly courteous to women. Sim laughed. Didn't you see how he looked at Laurel just now? He's the world's first lecher. He looks at more women than I could if I had two heads with necks that spun like an owl's. I do, I admitted. There's looking and there's looking, Phelan said to Simon. When some men look at you, it's a greasy thing. It makes you want to have a bath. With other men, it's nice. It helps you know you're beautiful. She ran a hand absently through her hair. You hardly need to be reminded, Simon said. Everyone needs to be reminded, she said. But with Kvath, it's different. He's so serious about it. When he looks at you, you can tell his whole attention is focused on you. She laughed at my uncomfortable expression. It's one of the things I liked about you when we met. Simon's expression darkened, and I tried to look as non-threatening as possible. But since you came back, it's almost physical, Phelan said. Now when you look at me, there's something happening behind your eyes. Something all sweet fruit, shadows, and lamplight. Something wild that fairy maidens run from underneath a violet sky. It's a terrible thing, really. I like it. As she said the last, she squirmed slightly in her seat, a wicked glitter in her eye. It was too much for Simon. He pushed his chair away from the table and started to get to his feet, making inarticulate gestures. Fine, then. Fine. Oh, sweetling, Phelan said, laying a hand on his arm. Hush, it's not like that. Don't hush me, he snapped, but he stayed in his chair. Phelan ran her hand through the hair on the back of Sim's neck. It's nothing you need worry over. She laughed as if the thought was ridiculous. You have me tied to you more tightly than you know, but that doesn't mean I can't enjoy a little flattery from time to time. Sim glowered. Should I cloister myself, then? Phelan asked. Irritation crept into her voice, bringing with it the barest lilt of her Modigan accent. You know how you feel when Mola takes the time to flirt with you? Simon gaped and looked as if he were trying to go pale and blush at the same time. Phelan laughed at his bewilderment. Tiny gods, Sim. Do you think I'm blind? It's a sweet thing, and it makes you feel good. What's the harm in it? There was a pause. Nothing, I suppose, Sim said finally. Looking up, he gave me a shaky grin and brushed his hair back from his eyes. Just don't ever give me the look she mentioned, okay? His grin widened, became more genuine. I don't know if I could handle it. I grinned back at him without thinking of it. Sim could always make me smile. Besides, Phelan said to him, you're perfect just the way you are. She kissed his ear as if to put the seal on his improving mood, then turned back to me. On the other hand, you couldn't pay me enough to get tangled up with you, she said flatly. What do you mean? I demanded. What about my look, my dark fairy whateverness? Oh, you're fascinating, but a girl wants more than that. She wants a man devoted to her. I shook my head. I refuse to throw myself at her like every other man she's ever met. She hates it. I've seen what happens. Have you ever thought she might feel the same way? Phelan asked. You do have something of a reputation with the ladies. Should I cloister myself, then? I said, repeating what she'd said to Sim, though it came out sharper than I'd intended. Black and body of God, I've seen her on the arms of 10 dozen men. Suddenly it's offensive to her if I take another woman out to see a play. Phelan gave me a frank look. You've been doing more than going for carriage rides. Women talk. Wonderful. And what do they say? I asked bitterly, looking down at my soup. That you're charming, she said easily, and polite. You don't have wandering hands, which is actually a source of frustration in some cases, apparently. She smiled a little. I looked up, curious. Who? Phelan hesitated. Meriden, she said. But you didn't hear it from me. She didn't say 20 words to me over dinner, I said, shaking my head. And she's disappointed I didn't grope her afterward? I thought she hated me. We're a long way from Modig, Phelan said. People aren't sensible about sex in this part of the world. Some women don't know how to deal with a man that doesn't make bold moves. Fine, I said. What else do they say? Nothing terribly surprising, she said. While you might not be grabby, it's certainly no challenge to trip you either. You're generous, witty, and... She trailed off, looking uncomfortable. Go ahead, I said. Phelan sighed and added, distant. It wasn't the crushing blow I'd expected. Distant? Sometimes all you're looking for is dinner, Phelan said, or company, or conversation, or for someone to have a friendly grope at you. But mostly you want a man to... She frowned and started over. When you're with a man... She trailed off again. I leaned forward. Say what you mean. Phelan shrugged and looked away. If we were together, I'd expect you to leave me. Not right away. Not with any malice or meanness. But I know you would. You don't seem like the sort who will settle down with a girl forever. Eventually you'd move on to something more important than me. I prodded idly at a bit of potato in my soup, not sure of what to think. There's got to be more to it than just devotion, Sim said. Cloth would turn the world upside down for this girl. You can see that, can't you? Folly gave me a long look. I suppose I can, she said softly. If you can see it, then Denna must be able to, Simon pointed out sensibly. Folly shook her head. It's only easy to see because I'm far enough away. Love is blind, Sim laughed. That's the advice you have to offer? He rolled his eyes. Please. I never said I was in love, I interjected. I never said that. She confuses me, and I'm fond of her. But it doesn't go further than that. How could it? I don't know her well enough to make any earnest claim of love. How can I love something I don't understand? They looked at me in silence for a moment. Then Sim burst out in his boyish laugh, as if I'd just said the most ridiculous thing he'd ever heard. He took hold of Fela's hand and kissed it squarely on her multifaceted ring of stone. You win, he said to her. Love is blind, and a deaf mute, too. I'll never doubt your wisdom again. Still feeling out of sorts, I went looking for Master Illidan, eventually finding him sitting under a tree in a small garden next to the mews. Cloth, he waved lazily. Come, sit. He nudged a bowl toward me with his foot. Have some grapes. I took a few. Fresh fruit wasn't a rarity for me these days, but the grapes were lovely nonetheless, just on the verge of being overripe. I chewed pensively, my mind still tangled with thoughts of Denna. Master Illidan, I asked slowly, what would you think of someone who kept changing their own name? What? He sat up suddenly, his eyes wild and panicked. What have you done? His reaction startled me, and I held up my hands defensively. Nothing, I insisted. It's not me. It's a girl I know. Illidan's face grew ashen. Fela? He said. Oh, no, she wouldn't do something like that. She's too smart for that. It sounded as if he were desperately trying to convince himself. I'm not talking about Fela, I said. I'm talking about a young girl I know. Every time I turn around, she's picked another name for herself. Oh, Illidan said, relaxing. He leaned back against the tree, laughing softly. Calling names, he said with a tangible relief. God's bones, boy, I thought... He broke off, shaking his head. You thought what? I asked. Nothing, he said dismissively. Now, what's this about a girl? I shrugged, beginning to regret bringing it up in the first place. I was just wondering what you'd say about a girl who keeps changing her name. Every time I turn around, she's picked a different one. Deanna, Donna, Diane. I'm assuming she's not some fugitive? Illidan asked, smiling. Hunted, doing her best to evade the iron law of a tour, that sort of thing? Not to the best of my knowledge, I said with a faint smile of my own. It could indicate she doesn't know who she is, he said, or that she does know and doesn't like it. He looked up and rubbed his nose thoughtfully. It could indicate restlessness and dissatisfaction. It could mean her nature is changeable and she shifts her name to fit it. Or it could mean she changes her name with the hope it might help her be a different person. Dog poo. That's a lot of nothing, I said testily. It's like saying you know your soup is either hot or cold, that an apple is either sweet or sour. I gave him a frown. It's just a complicated way of saying you don't know anything. You didn't ask me what I knew of such a girl, he pointed out. You asked me what I would say of such a girl. I shrugged, tiring of the subject. We ate grapes in silence as we watched the students come and go. I called the wind again, I said, realizing I hadn't told him yet. Down in Tarbean. He perked up at that. Did you now? He said, turning to look at me expectantly. Let's hear it then. All the details. Illidan was everything you could want in an audience, attentive and enthusiastic. I related the entire story, not sparing a few dramatic flourishes. By the end of it, I found my mood much improved. That's 3 times this term, Illidan said approvingly. Sought and found when you had need of it. And not just a breeze, but a breath. That's subtle stuff. He looked at me from the corner of his eye, giving me a sly smile. How long do you think it will be before you can make yourself a ring of air? I lifted up my naked left hand, fingers spread. Who's to say I'm not already wearing it? Illidan rocked with laughter, then stopped when my expression didn't change. His brow furrowed a bit as he gave me a speculative look, eyes flickering first to my hand, then back to my face. Are you joking? He asked. That's a good question, I said, looking him calmly in the eye. Am I? Chapter 150. Folly. Spring term rolled on. Contrary to what I expected, Denna didn't make any public performances in Imra. Instead, she headed north to Annalyn after a handful of days. But this time she made a special trip to Anchors to tell me she was leaving. I found myself strangely flattered by this, and couldn't help but feel it was a sign that things were not entirely sour between us. The Chancellor fell ill just as the term was coming to a close. Though I didn't know him very well, I liked Herma. Not only did I find him to be a surprisingly easygoing teacher when he had been teaching me Yiddish, but he had been kind to me when I was new to the university. Nevertheless, I wasn't particularly worried. Arwell and the staff of the Medica could do everything just short of bringing people back from the dead. But days passed and no news came from the Medica. Rumor said he was too weak to leave his bed, plagued with spikes of fever that threatened to burn away his powerful arcanist's mind. When it became apparent he wouldn't be able to resume his duties as Chancellor any time soon, the masters gathered to decide who would fill his place, perhaps permanently, should his condition worsen. And to make a painful story short, Hem was appointed Chancellor. After the shock wore off, it was easy to see why. Kilvin, Arwell, and Lauren were too busy to take up the extra duties. The same could be said for Mandrag and Dal to a lesser extent. That left Elodin, Brander, and Hem. Elodin didn't want it, and was generally regarded as too erratic to serve, and Brander always faced whatever direction Hem's own wind was blowing. So Hem gained the Chancellor's chair. While I found it irritating, it had little impact on my day-to-day life. The only precaution I took was to step with extra care around even the least of the university's laws, knowing that if I were put on the horns now, Hem's vote would count doubly against me. As admissions approached, Master Herma remained weak and fevered, so it was with a knot of sour dread in my stomach that I prepared for my first admissions interview with Hem as Chancellor. I went through the questioning with the same careful artifice I'd maintained for the last 2 terms. I hesitated and made a few mistakes, earning a tuition of 20 talents or so, enough to earn some money, but not enough to embarrass myself too badly. Hem, as always, asked double-sided or misleading questions designed to trip me, but that was nothing new. The only real difference seemed to be that Hem smiled a great deal. It wasn't a pleasant smile, either. The masters had their usual muted conference. Then Hem read my tuition, 50 talents. Apparently the Chancellor had greater control over these things than I had ever known. I forced myself to bite my lip to keep from laughing, and arranged my face in a dejected expression as I made my way to the basement of Hollows, where the bursar kept his counting room. Reem's eyes brightened at the sight of my tuition slip. He disappeared into his back room and returned in a moment with an envelope of thick paper. I thanked him and returned to my room at Anchors, maintaining my morose expression all the way. Once I had the door closed, I tore open the heavy envelope and poured its contents into my hand. 2 gleaming gold marks worth 10 talents each. I laughed then. I laughed until my eyes watered and my sides ached. Then I drew on my best suit of clothes and gathered my friends, Willem and Simon, Fella and Mola. I sent a runner boy to Imra with an invitation to Devi and Thrape. Then I hired a 4-horse carriage and had the lot of us driven across the river to Imra. We stopped by the Aeolian. Denna wasn't there, but I collected Deoch instead, and we made our way to the King's Arms, an establishment of the sort no self-respecting student could ever afford. The doorman looked the motley lot of us over scornfully, as if he would object, but Thrape frowned his best gentleman's frown and ushered all of us safely inside. Then commenced a night of pleasant decadence, the likes of which I have hardly seen equalled since. We ate and drank, and I paid for everything happily. The only water on the table was in the hand bowls. In our cups there was only old vintage wines, dark Scutton, cool metheglin, sweet brand, and every toast we drank was to Hem's Folly. Chapter 151. Locks. Kvoth drew a deep breath and nodded to himself. "Let's stop there," he said. "Money in my pocket for the first time in my life. Surrounded by friends. That's a good place to end for the night." He idly rubbed his hands together, right hand massaging the left absent-mindedly. "If we go much farther, things get dark again." Chronicler picked up the short stack of finished pages and tapped them on the table, squaring their corners before resting the half-finished page on top. He opened his leather satchel, removed the bright green crown of holly, and slid the pages inside. Then he screwed shut his inkwell and began to dismantle and clean all the pieces of his pen. Kvoth stood and stretched. Then he gathered up the empty plates and cups, carrying them into the kitchen. Bast merely sat, his expression blank. He didn't move. He hardly seemed to be breathing. After several minutes, Chronicler began to dart glances in his direction. Kvothe came back into the room and frowned. "Bast," he said. Bast slowly turned his eyes to look at the man behind the bar. "Shep's wake is still going on," Kvothe said. "There's not much cleaning up to do tonight. Why don't you head over for the end of it? They'll be glad to have you." Bast considered for a moment, then shook his head. "I don't think so, Reshi," he said, his voice flat. "I'm not really in the mood." He pushed himself out of his chair and made his way across the room toward the stairs without looking either of them in the eye. "I'll just turn in." The hard sounds of his footsteps retreated slowly into the distance, followed by the sound of a closing door. Chronicler watched him go, then turned to look at the red-haired man behind the bar. Kvothe was looking at the stairway too, his eyes concerned. "He's just had a rough day," he said, sounding as if he were speaking to himself as much as his guest. "He'll be fine tomorrow." Wiping off his hands, Kvothe walked around the bar and headed to the front door. "Do you need anything before you turn in?" he asked. Chronicler shook his head and began fitting his pen back together. Kvothe locked the front door with a large brass key, then turned to Chronicler. "I'll leave this in the lock for you," he said, "in case you wake up early and feel like having a walk or some such. I don't tend to sleep very much these days." He touched the side of his face where a bruise was beginning to mottle his jaw. "But tonight I might make an exception." Chronicler nodded and shouldered his satchel. Then he delicately picked up his holly crown and headed up the stairs. Alone in the common room, Kvothe swept the floor methodically, catching all the corners. He finished the dishes, washed the tables in the bar, and rolled down all the lamps but one, leaving the room dimly lit and full of flickering shadow. For a moment he looked at the bottles behind the bar, then turned and made his own slow climb upstairs. Bast stepped slowly into his room, closing the door behind himself. He moved quietly through the dark to stand before the hearth. Nothing but ash and cinder remained from the morning fire. Bast opened the wood bin, but there was nothing inside except a thick layer of chaff and chips at the bottom. The dim light from the window glinted in his dark eyes and showed the outline of his face as he stood motionless, as if trying to decide what to do. After a moment he let the lid of the bin fall closed, wrapped himself in a blanket, and folded himself onto a small couch in front of the empty fireplace. He sat there for a long while, eyes open in the dark. There was a faint scuffle outside his window, then nothing, then a faint scraping. Bast turned and saw a dark shape outside, moving in the night. Bast went motionless, then slid smoothly from the couch to stand in front of the fireplace. With his eyes still on the window, his hands hunted carefully across the top of the mantel. There was another scrape at the window, louder this time. Bast's eyes darted away from the window to the mantel, and he caught up something with both hands. Metal gleamed faintly in the dim moonlight as he crouched, his body tense as a coiled spring. For a long moment there was nothing, no sound, no movement outside the window or in the darkened room. Tap, 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 tap. It was a faint noise, but perfectly clear in the stillness of the room. There was a pause, and then the noise came again, sharp and insistent against the window glass. Tap, 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 tap. Bast sighed. Relaxing out of his tense crouch, he walked over to the window, through the drop bar, and opened it. "My window doesn't have a lock," Chronicler said petulantly. "Why does yours?" "Obvious reasons," Bast said. "Can I come in?" Bast shrugged and moved back toward the fireplace while Chronicler climbed awkwardly through the window. Bast struck a match and lit a lamp on a nearby table, then carefully set a pair of long knives on the mantel. One was slender and sharp as a blade of grass, the other keen and graceful as a thorn. Chronicler looked around as light swelled to fill the room. Just gonna mute this. Okay, sorry about that. Is it still, hopefully it's still going. I was trying to just mute it. Yes, I did that by accident. New phone. I was trying to just mute it so that it doesn't buzz again. But, it's not like my old phone where you can just click the button on the side to do that. You have to, go into a menu. And when I did that, it paused the video. So sorry. I've been trying to, mess with the settings to try to see if there's a way to make it so that I can just mute it or put it on vibrate or whatever with just the side button, the volume button. Because, I don't like that I have to, take 3 extra steps to do that. Okay, anyway. Okay. Chronicler looked around as light swelled to fill the room. It was large, with rich wood paneling and thick carpets. Two lounging couches faced each other in front of the fireplace, and one corner of the room was dominated by a huge canopy bed with deep green curtains. There were shelves filled with pictures, trinkets, and oddments. Locks of hair wrapped in ribbon, whistles carved from wood, dried flowers, rings of horn and leather and woven grass, a hand-dipped candle with leaves pressed into the wax. And in what was obviously a recent addition, holly boughs decorated parts of the room. One long garland ran along the headboard of the bed, and another was strung along the mantel, weaving in and out through the handles of a pair of bright, leaf-bladed hatchets hanging there. Bast sat back in front of the cold fireplace and wrapped a rag blanket around his shoulders like a shawl. It was a chaos of ill-matching fabric and faded color except for a bright red heart sewn squarely in the center. "We need to talk," Chronicler said softly. Bast shrugged, his eyes fixed dully on the fireplace. Chronicler took a step closer. "I need to ask you." "You don't have to whisper," Bast said without looking up. "We're on the other side of the inn. Sometimes I have guests. It used to keep them... it used to keep him awake, so I moved to this side of the building. There are 6 solid walls between my room and his." Chronicler sat on the edge of the other couch, facing Bast. "I need to ask about some of the things you said tonight, about the Cathay." "We shouldn't talk about the Cathay." Bast's voice was flat and leaden. "It's not healthy." "The Sith, then," Chronicler said. "You said if they knew about this story, they'd kill everyone involved. Is that true?" Bast nodded, his eyes still on the fireplace. "They'd burn this place and salt the earth behind them, and then salt the earth behind them." Chronicler looked down, shaking his head. "I don't understand this fear you have of the Cathay," he said. "Well," Bast said, "evidence seems to indicate that you're not terribly smart." Chronicler frowned and waited patiently. Bast sighed, finally pulling his eyes away from the fireplace. "Think. The Cathay knows everything you're ever going to do, everything you're going to say. That makes it an irritating conversationalist," Chronicler said, "but not—" Bast's expression went suddenly furious. "Dien Vahat, and Fionn Vahat to Lauren Tess!" He spat almost incoherently. He was trembling, clenching and unclenching his hands. Chronicler went pale at the venom in Bast's voice, but he didn't flinch. "You're not angry at me," he said calmly, looking Bast in the eye. "You're just angry, and I happen to be nearby." Bast glared at him, but he said nothing. Chronicler leaned forward. "I'm trying to help, you know that, right?" Bast nodded sullenly. "That means I need to understand what's going on." Bast shrugged. His sudden flare of temper had burned itself out, leaving him listless again. "Voth seems to believe you about the Cathay," Chronicler said. "He knows the hidden turnings of the world," Bast said, and what he doesn't understand, he's quick to grasp. Bast's fingers flicked idly at the edges of the blanket. "And he trusts me." "But doesn't it seem contrived? The Cathay gives a boy a flower, one thing leads to another, and suddenly there's a war?" Chronicler made a dismissive motion. "Things don't work that way. It's too much coincidence." "It's not coincidence," Bast gave a short sigh. "A blind man has to stumble through a cluttered room. You don't. You use your eyes and pick the easy way. It's clear to you as anything. The Cathay can see the future. All futures. We have to fumble through. It doesn't. It merely looks and picks the most disastrous path. It is the stone that stirs the avalanche. It is the cough that starts the plague." "But if you know the Cathay is trying to steer you," Chronicler said, "you would just do something else. It gives you the flower, and you just sell it." Bast shook his head. "Cathay would know. You can't second-guess a thing that knows your future. Say you sell the flower to the prince. He uses the flower to heal his betrothed. A year later, she catches him diddling the chambermaid, hangs herself in disgrace, and her father launches an attack to avenge her honor." Bast spread his hands helplessly. "You still get civil war. But the young man who sold the flower stays safe." "Probably not," Bast said grimly. "More likely he gets drunk as a lord, catches the pox, then knocks over a lamp and sets half the city on fire." "You're just making things up to prove your point," Chronicler said. "You're not actually proving anything." "Why do I need to prove anything to you?" Bast asked. "Why would I care what you think? Be happy in your silly little ignorance. I'm doing you a favor by not telling you the truth." "What truth is that?" Chronicler said, plainly irritated. Bast gave a weary sigh and looked up at Chronicler, his expression utterly empty of all hope. "I would rather fight Haliax himself," he said. I'd rather face all the Chandrian together than have 10 words of conversation with the Cathay. This gave Chronicler a bit of a pause. They'd kill you, he said. Something in his voice made it a question. Yes, Bast said. Even so. Chronicler stared at the dark-haired man sitting across from him, wrapped in a rag blanket. Stories taught you to fear the Cathay, he said, disgust plain in his voice. And that fear is making you stupid. Bast shrugged, his empty eyes drifting back to the non-existent fire. You bore me, manling. Chronicler stood up, stepped forward, and slapped Bast hard across the face. Bast's head rocked to the side, and for a moment he seemed too shocked to move. Then he came to his feet in a blur of motion, blanket flying from his shoulders. He grabbed Chronicler roughly by the throat, teeth bared, his eyes a deep, unbroken blue. Chronicler looked him squarely in the eye. The Cathay set all of this in motion, he said calmly. It knew you would attack me, and terrible things will come of it. Bast's furious expression went stiff, his eyes widening. The tension left his shoulders as he let go of Chronicler's throat. He started to sink down onto the cushions of the couch. Chronicler drew back his arm and slapped him again. If anything, the sound was even louder than before. Bast bared his teeth again, then stopped. His eyes darted to Chronicler, then away. The Cathay knows you fear it, Chronicler said. It knows I would use that knowledge against you. It's still manipulating you. If you don't attack me, terrible things will come of it. Bast froze as if paralyzed, trapped halfway between standing and sitting. Are you listening to me? Chronicler said. Are you finally awake? Bast looked up at the scribe with an expression of confused amazement. A bright red mark was blossoming on his cheek. He nodded, sinking slowly back onto the couch. Chronicler drew back his arm. What will you do if I hit you again? Beat 10 colors of guts out of you, Bast said earnestly. Chronicler nodded and sat back down on his couch. I will, for the sake of argument, accept that the Cathay knows the future. That means it can control many things. He raised a finger. But not everything. The fruit you ate today was still sweet in your mouth, wasn't it? Bast nodded slowly. If the Cathay is as malicious as you say, it would harm you in every way possible. But it cannot. It could not keep you from making your Reshi laugh this morning. It could not keep you from enjoying the sun on your face or kissing the rosy cheeks of farmers' daughters, could it? A flicker of a grin found Bast's face. I kissed more than that, he said. That, Chronicler said firmly, is my point. It cannot poison everything we do. Bast looked thoughtful, then sighed. You're right, in a way, he said, but only an idiot sits in a burning house and thinks everything is fine because fruit is still sweet. Chronicler made a point of looking around the room. The inn doesn't look like it's on fire to me. Bast looked at him incredulously. The whole world is burning down, he said. Open your eyes. Chronicler frowned. Even ignoring everything else, he said, bullying ahead. Felurian let him go. She knew he'd spoken with the Cathay. Surely she wouldn't have loosened him on the world unless she had some way to guard against its influence. Bast's eyes brightened at the thought, then dimmed almost immediately. He shook his head. You're looking for depth in a shallow stream, he said. I don't follow you, Chronicler demanded. What possible reason could she have for letting him go if he was truly dangerous? Reason? Bast asked, dark amusement coloring his voice. No reason. She's got nothing to do with reason. She let him go because it pleased her pride. She wanted him to go out into the mortal world and sing her praises, tell stories about her, pine for her. That's why she let him leave. He sighed. I've already told you. My folk are not famous for our good decisions. Perhaps, Chronicler said. Or perhaps she simply recognized the futility of trying to second-guess the Cathay. He made a nonchalant gesture. If whatever you're going to do is wrong, you might as well do whatever you want. Bast sat quietly for a long moment. Then he nodded, faintly at first, then more firmly. You're right, he said. If everything is going to end in tears anyway, I should do what I want. Bast looked around the room, then came suddenly to his feet. After a moment's searching, he found a thick cloak crumpled on the floor. He gave it a vigorous shake and wrapped it around his shoulders before heading to the window. Then he stopped, came back to the couch, and rummaged in the cushions until he found a bottle of wine. Chronicler looked puzzled. What are you doing? Are you going back to Shep's wake? Bast paused on his way back to the window, seeming almost surprised to see Chronicler still standing there. I am going about my business, he said, tucking the bottle of wine under his arm. He opened the window and swung one foot outside. Don't wait up. That's what I was thinking too. Cathay started the pandemic. Quoth stepped briskly into his room, closing the door behind himself. He moved about busily. He cleared the cold ashes from the fireplace and set new wood in its place, sparking the fire to life with a fat, red sulphur match. He fetched a second blanket and spread it over his narrow bed. Frowning slightly, he picked up the crumpled piece of paper from where it had fallen to the floor and returned it to the top of his desk, where it sat next to the two other crumpled sheets. Then, moving almost reluctantly, he made his way to the foot of his bed. Taking a deep breath, he wiped his hands on his pants and knelt in front of the dark chest that sat there. He rested both hands on the curved lid and closed his eyes, as if listening for something. His shoulders shifted as he tugged against the lid. Nothing happened. Quoth opened his eyes. His mouth made a grim line. His hands moved again, pulling harder, straining for a long moment before giving up. Expressionless, Quoth stood and walked to the window that overlooked the woods behind the inn. He slid it open and leaned out, reaching down with both hands. Then he drew himself back inside, clutching a slender wooden box. Brushing away a coating of dust and spiderwebs, he opened the box. Inside lay a key of dark iron and a key of bright copper. Quoth knelt in front of the chest again and fit the copper key into the iron lock. With slow precision he turned it, left, then right, then left again, listening carefully to the faint clicks of some mechanism inside. Then he lifted the iron key and fitted it into the copper plate. This key he did not turn. He slid it deep into the lock, brought it halfway out, then pushed it back before drawing it free in a smooth, quick motion. After replacing the keys in their box, he put his hands back out on the sides of the lid in the same position as before. "Open," he said under his breath. "Open, damn you. Edro." He lifted, his back and shoulders tensing with the effort of it. The lid of the chest didn't budge. Quoth gave a long sigh and leaned forward until his forehead pressed against the cool, dark wood. As the air rushed out of him, his shoulders sagged, leaving him looking small and wounded, terribly tired and older than his years. His expression, however, showed no surprise, no grief. It was merely resigned. It was the expression of a man who has finally received bad news he'd already known was on the way. Wait. This is the last chapter. Chapter 152. Elderberry. It was a bad night to be caught in the open. The clouds had rolled in late, like a gray sheet pulled across the sky. The wind was chill and gusty, with fits and starts of rain that spattered down heavily before fading into drizzle. For all this, the two soldiers camped in a thicket near the road seemed to be enjoying themselves. They'd found a woodcutter's stash and built their fire so high and hot that the occasional gust of rain did little more than make it spit and hiss. The two men were talking loudly, laughing the wild, braying laughter of men too drunk to care about the weather. Eventually a third man emerged from the dark trees, stepping delicately over the trunk of a nearby fallen tree. He was wet, if not soaked, and his dark hair was plastered flat to his head. When the soldiers saw him, they lifted their bottles and called out an enthusiastic greeting. "Didn't know if you'd make it," the blonde soldier said. "It's a shit night, but it's only fair you get your third." "You're wet through," said the bearded one, lifting up a narrow yellow bottle. "Suck on this. It's some... Oh, suck on this." I don't know why I said it like that. "Suck on this. It's some fruit thing, but it kicks like a pony." "Yours is girly piss," the blonde soldier said, holding up his own. "Here. Now this here is a man's drink." The third man looked back and forth as if unable to decide. Finally he lifted a finger, pointing at one bottle then the other, as he began to chant. "Maple, maypole, catch and carry, ash and ember, elderberry." He ended pointing at the yellow bottle, then gripped it by the neck and lifted it to his lips. He took a long, slow drink, his throat working silently. "Hey there," said the bearded soldier. "Save a bit." Bast lowered the bottle and licked his lips. He gave a dry, humorless chuckle. "You got the right bottle," he said. "It's elderberry." "You're nowhere near as chatty as you were this morning," the blonde soldier said, cocking his head to one side. "You look like your dog died. Is everything all right?" "No," Bast said. "Nothing's all right." "It ain't our fault if you figured it out," the blonde one said quickly. "We waited a bit after you left, just like you said, but we'd been sitting for hours already. Thought you were never going to leave." "Hell," the bearded man said, irritated. Does he know? He throw you out?" Bast shook his head and tipped the bottle back again. "Then you ain't got nothing to complain of." The blonde soldier rubbed the side of his head, scowling. "Silly bastard gave me a lump or two." "He got it back with some time to spare," the bearded soldier grinned, rubbing his thumb across his knuckles. "He'll be pissing blood tomorrow." "So it's all good at the end," the blonde soldier said philosophically, lurching unsteadily as he waved his bottle a little too dramatically. You got to skin your knuckles. I got a drink of something lovely, and we all made a heavy penny. Everyone's happy. Everyone gets what they wanted most. I didn't get what I wanted, Bast said flatly. Not yet, the bearded soldier said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a purse that made a weighty chink as he bounced it in his palm. Grab a piece of fire and we'll divvy this up. Bast looked around the circle of firelight, making no move to take a seat. Then he began to chant again as he pointed at things randomly, a nearby stone, a log, a hatchet. Follow, farrow, ash and oak, bide and borrow, chimney smoke. He ended pointing at the fire. He stepped close, stooped low, and pulled out a branch longer than his arm. The far end was a solid knot of glowing coal. Hell, you're drunker than I am, the bearded soldier guffawed. That's not what I meant when I said grab a piece of fire. The blonde soldier rolled with laughter. Bast looked down at the two men. After a moment he began to laugh too. It was a terrible sound, jagged and joyless. It was no human laugh. Hoy! The bearded man interrupted sharply, his expression no longer amused. What's the matter with you? It began to rain again, a gust of wind spattering heavy drops against Bast's face. His eyes were dark and intent. There was another gust of wind that made the end of the branch flare a brilliant orange. The hot coal traced a glowing arc through the air as Bast began to point it back and forth between the two men, chanting, barrel, barley, stone and stave, wind and water, misbehave. Bast finished with the burning branch pointing at the bearded man. His teeth were red in the firelight. His expression was nothing like a smile. Epilogue. A silence of 3 parts. It was night again. The Waystone Inn lay in silence, and it was a silence of 3 parts. The most obvious part was a hollow, echoing quiet, made by things that were lacking. If there had been a steady rain, it would have drummed against the roof, sluiced the eaves, and washed the silence slowly out to sea. If there had been lovers in the beds of the inn, they would have sighed and moaned and shamed the silence into being on its way. If there had been music... But no, of course there was no music. In fact, there were none of these things, and so the silence remained. Outside the Waystone, the noise of distant revelry blew faintly through the trees. A strain of fiddle, voices, stomping boots and clapping hands. But the sound was slender as a thread, and a shift in the wind broke it, leaving only rustling leaves and something almost like the far-off shrieking of an owl. That faded, too, leaving nothing but the second silence, waiting like an endless indrawn breath. The third silence was not an easy thing to notice. If you listened for an hour, you might begin to feel it in the chill metal of a dozen locks turned tight to keep the night away. It lay in rough clay jugs of cider and the hollow tap-room gaps where chairs and tables ought to be. It was in the mottling ache of bruises that loomed across a body, and it was in the hands of the man who wore the bruises as he rose stiffly from his bed, teeth clenched against the pain. The man had true red hair, red as flame. His eyes were dark and distant, and he moved with the subtle certainty of a thief in the night. He made his way downstairs. There, behind the tightly shuttered windows, he lifted his hands like a dancer, shifted his weight, and slowly took one single, perfect step. The Waystone was his, just as the third silence was his. This was appropriate, as it was the greatest silence of the 3, wrapping the others inside itself. It was deep and wide as autumn's ending. It was heavy as a great river-smooth stone. It was the patient, cut-flower sound of a man who was waiting to die. And now, we wait. Oh, sorry, Louie, I didn't mean to startle you. So cool, that's that. Oh, I hope that we get a 3rd book soon. This has been really fun. And it's hard to believe it's over, but until we get the 3rd book... When's the next reading? Well, let's ask Patrick Rothfuss when that book is going to be freaking finished already. Maybe this year. Probably not, because it's already October. I mean, sometime within the next 15 years, sure. That was an interesting ending. So he's, yes, if it's an outline, I'll read it. whatever format it's in, I'll read it. So, I mean, I guess that wasn't the worst cliffhanger it could have been. Just, he's clearly about to kill those guys that he apparently paid to, or they were all hired to. I'm not sure what happened there. Like, he was in on it when they came and attacked Koth. I don't know why. So there's a lot of questions that we are left with. So cool. Thanks for tuning in for all of these over the last, it's been over a year, because I'm already, yeah, just over a year, because I've been getting the Facebook memory things of the readings of the first book. Oh, that's a good observation. Yeah, maybe that's all it was. And now he's just gonna, like, burn these guys to death. This guy's crazy. I like how, we get, like, little hints of who he is, but just enough to leave us wanting more information. So maybe the third book will focus more on him. Or maybe the third book will never come out, and this is just it. That's all. Because it seems like this is, like, the last stage of Kvot's life, and he, like, doesn't care anymore. So what else can really be done? Yeah, we definitely need more information, more backstory on Bast. More information about their relationship. Do fan fiction to fill that void somehow. I don't know. I don't think they should. There are other Name of the Wind books. What are you talking about? You mean the little... Didn't you say something about, like, little comics or something? Are they written by the author? Send me some more information about that. But yeah, yeah, I mentioned before, I bought this book and planning to read it next, American Gods. It's about the same, like, looks like to be about the same length as these. So, it's a long read again. And, somebody was saying that I should continue the readings, so I might read this, and, might do it on Twitch. Like, just stream it on Twitch. See how that goes. I'm considering it. I'm gonna read it regardless. I might like try to read it at a faster, like my own fast pace, like, you know, read it every day instead of like once or twice a week. But the readings could be probably once or twice a week again, but even if I've like already read it, I'll just like reread what I didn't read on the stream before. Before I start rambling, I'm gonna end this, I think. So yeah, I may or may not do that, but for now, thanks for everything. This is a really great book series, and I'm looking forward to finishing it one day. Yeah, I'm glad you guys have been enjoying it. It was a fun activity. Especially during quarantine, which we're not really doing so much now, I guess, anymore. I mean, I'm not going out to a ton of places, so it doesn't feel too different than last year, but I know that people are getting back to their lives, so it's a little bit harder to schedule these things. Harder to be free for them. But we'll see. Anyway. Have a good night, and talk to you guys later. Bye.